Hello again folks, and welcome to this particular screencast which is going to be talking about post-industrial Britain, and it's the first in our post-industrial Britain screencasts. The second one will follow on with this with other characteristics of post-industrial Britain. This particular screencast will cover the early aspects of post-industrial Britain and what happened initially, as well as some of the more detailed aspects that happen around the midpoint of this century. Alright, just to remind you or recap that you should have already covered pre-industrial Britain, so the time period from 1600 to 1800, Henry VIII, real tennis, mob football, etc. And you should be able to apply the social, cultural factors that are now on the screen to that particular time frame, because the exam questions are going to ask you about that. So make sure you have covered that before you start this particular screencast. Alright, so we're now moving into a time period of 1800 to 1914. And what we did with the last time period, the pre-industrial time period, we had this acronym, SCALCORN, to remember the characteristics, the social characteristics of that time period. Well, in terms of this new time period, post-industrial Britain, we have a different acronym called PERFECA. And that PERFECA stands for the following that you see on screen. So I'll do it in order for you. Purpose-built facilities, urban and suburban, regular fixtures and games, regional, national and international games, fair play, elitist or exclusive games, control of wagering, codification, which was the creation of rules for games, and amateurism and professionalism for the different classes. And so that lists up to PERFECA if you use the first letter of each of what I've just said. These new characteristics will now need to be compared to the old characteristics of pre-industrial Britain. So what I'd like you to do on the next slide is have a look at the grid that I've shown, and can you match them against each other? So if I show you the slide, the dark pink characteristics on the left are the new post-industrial Britain characteristics of sport, and the lighter pink characteristics on the right are the pre-industrial characteristics of sport. And what I'd like you to do is try and match them up, see how they now compare, because then you can compare characteristics for exam questions that might ask that. What are the differences or the similarities, if you like, between pre-industrial Britain sporting characteristics and post-industrial Britain sporting characteristics? So if you make a chart or make a little grid for yourself and match these up, that's probably a good starting point for this time frame. So let's get into the idea of the 1800s, or indeed sort of the late 1700s if you like. We had this big thing in Britain, the Industrial Revolution, and essentially we had the technology develop where steam machines and factory machines were being produced on a massive scale. And this led to a difference in working for people in Britain. Originally, the majority of the population in Britain would have been working on farmlands between 1600 and towards the end of the 1700s. And so what we call that is seasonal time, in the fact that the farmers can only work in accordance with the seasons. If it was a very barren, dry, hot summer, they might lose crops and therefore lose money on the sale of those crops. If it was too wet, they might lose crops. And so therefore, the monetary income from farming was restricted because it was all negotiated by the weather. This new industrial revolution changed things because it meant that the working class could then work what we call machine time, and that means they could clock in at sort of 8 o'clock in the morning, etc., clock out at 10 p.m. in the evening after doing a day shift, and they would earn a set amount of money or a set wage. The Industrial Revolution also introduced the following as an overview. We've talked about the new machines and new technology, but obviously that would then impact on sport because you've got new technology being developed for sporting activities. It also went back to the farmlands. It would develop ploughs and other farming machinery that would make life easier for farmers, as well as the introduction of new transport methods such as the train. As I mentioned earlier on, a lot of people worked in the farmlands, and what they did was they ended up moving to cities to work in factories, and we call that movement from open spaces to crammed city centre ideas urbanisation. So that's the moving of people to one particular place to live. And of course, because of this system, we ended up with a totally new class structure. Remember, previously we had the popular, the working class, and the courtly, the gentry or the upper class. So there was just two classes in society, and now in this time period we've got the development of a new class, the middle class. The middle class were not necessarily related to the upper class, although some were, but they'd inherited a small amount of money as opposed to a greater amount of money. There might have been many siblings of upper class families, and somebody in the upper class family might have died, and the spread of wealth would have been thinner as opposed to having one or two sons or daughters to the son or daughter that would inherit. And so these middle class people had a fair amount of money, but not as much as the upper class. And they thought to themselves, what can we do with this money? And they decided to develop factories, steam-based factories, in order to develop products they can sell for goods and therefore make more money or more return on that investment. The problem with that idea is that these factories then needed workers. And so there will be adverts for workers put out, and therefore these farmers or people working in the countryside would then be attracted to the idea of machine time, working for a set wage for set hours, and we could then move people to the cities to work in this idea. Britain very quickly then became a three-class society. So you can see the structure here. We've got the lower class who were working at this point for around about 72 hours a week initially. We've got these middle-class individuals who were the factory owners, not born into aristocracy, but they might have inherited sums. And then we had the idea of the upper class who were just almost in a league of their own in terms of free time and in terms of money. They had masses of inheritance, masses of land, wealth, and they had lots of leisure time. So the upper class was so distinct now from the lower class, but also the middle class were very distinct from that lower class section. The new middle class had more time and money than the working class because they owned these factories. And so therefore they also had a lot of free leisure time, and this impacted very clearly on sport. Now when we talk about the 1800s, we talk about the first half of the century and we talk about the second half of the century because it was quite distinct. Initially, the first half of the century, so between 1800 and roughly around about 1850, the working class had a very poor lifestyle. They had to work 12-hour shifts, so often a 72-hour working week. That's a lot of time to be doing a job. Whole families would be working, so children as young as 5 would be sent to the factory to work or have some sort of employed income. Therefore, they had very little time for sport at all. In terms of their living conditions, a lot of families were placed in one house. You might have 4, 5, 6 families placed in one house, each family of 4, 5, 6 people. There might be a water pump for a row of 6, 7 houses. And so quickly the living conditions were very cramped. They lost space and disease was rife. There was a cholera outbreak at this period of time, in the early 1800s, which killed a lot of people because they didn't have access to clean water and basic hygiene per household. So not only did they lose their time to play sport, they lost their space to play sport, and they lost their own health. So they weren't very well conditioned to then go out and play some form of sporting activity. Added to that, they lost their rights to play sport, which I'll mention later on, in the fact that middle class and the church were pressing down on them to do different things. This just meant that the working class didn't play much activity of what they had before. There was very little mob football going on, for example. Cricket would have taken a little bit of a back seat, for example. There would still be small space-based games, and pedestrianism still continued in some places, but these things were a little bit less frequent than they were in the previous century. Things then changed in the second half of the century, sort of 1850 onwards. We had a new queen, Queen Victoria, around about the 1830s, and she was very keen to change things in terms of laws for different classes, as well as introduce an education system of some description. So the first thing that was introduced by law was a Saturday half day and Wednesday early closing, round about 1850 plus. Now this did two things. Number one, on Saturday half days, that started the idea of games or regular fixtures for teams. Factory teams could be created and they could have a game of some activity against each other. For example, football, cricket fixtures, we played Saturday 3 o'clock because this was the Saturday half day, and that's where that tradition started. Wednesday early closing for some factories also meant that they could train or, again, play games or fixtures. Such clubs as Football Club Sheffield Wednesday were originally a cricket club, then formed into a football club, but they met on a Wednesday afternoon, and hence the name Sheffield Wednesday. The factory owners, although initially in the first half of the century didn't want the workers to take time off, they understood that if they made the workers feel a bit happier, a bit healthier, we'd get more work out of them. And so these sort of things developed. They developed factory teams. The three you've got on the screen there, Sheffield Wednesday top left, you've got a factory team called Dial Square, who became Arsenal Football Club, and Newton Heath, who became Manchester United Football Club. All factory teams started to increase energy for labour. You also had a reduction in working hours for the working class by the end of the century. There was a reduction in working hours for women and children. There was a reduction in overall working hours for men. Added to this, you had other things that went on. Every year, the factory owner would treat the workers to an excursion to the seaside, just one day. So by the end of that century, the factory worker would say, okay, this is the day we're going to have an excursion. They'd all get on a train to Brighton. They'd enjoy some fresh air and make them feel a bit more healthier. You had a paid week's holiday by the end of the century. That was something that was new. So this meant that you had more time to play and opportunities for sport were being developed. I mentioned earlier on about this idea of the middle class industrialists, and the church in particular were really pinning down the working class at the start of the 1800s. There's a couple of reasons for that. Compared to pre-industrial Britain, where we had violent and cruel games, lots of drinking association with games, lots of mob-handed style games for the working class, well, society was changing. The middle class wanted to copy the upper class. They wanted to be this idea of a gentleman. They would read books in their spare time, and you'd see them reading in the park or reading in their gardens. And so the attitude and culture of society was starting to develop and to be more gentlemanly, but of civil behaviour, manners and etiquette. And this created a difference between the middle class and the working class. But the middle class were constantly looking down on the upper class and trying to promote this idea of gentlemanly behaviour to them. The aim of this was to reform poor behaviour. The church frowned upon drinking and violent games, and so they introduced vicars' tea parties in order to help reform these ideas. They were really trying to change people for the better and civilise society. That's a good phrase to write down for your notes. It's called the civilisation process. So that was what was occurring in this time frame, to be respectful to each other and to have manners and etiquette. On top of this, you then had laws being developed. And the laws were being developed by the upper and middle classes. And they were very clever, these people. They decided to almost try and eradicate cruel and violent games. And this happened through two things. Number one, the RSPCA were developed in 1824. And this put a little bit of a ban on cruel animal-based games like bear baiting and badger baiting, ratting, dog fighting. These things started to become less and less because of the RSPCA. Added to that, in 1828, you had the formation of the Metropolitan Police Force. And therefore, the Metropolitan Police Force, not only were they controlling laws, they were also controlling wagering and gambling. Gambling and wagering still went on and was still a very important part of British society, but there was a little bit more control over it because we have this police force actioning such things in relation to sport. The amusing thing about all of this is, as I mentioned before, all these laws were passed by the upper or middle classes. So they controlled cruelty to animal games, but decided to keep fox hunting and all-day hunts for themselves because they were the ones creating the laws. And so they enjoyed those pursuits. They didn't want those laws to stop. Okay, thanks for watching this screencast on the starting of post-industrial Britain. Please make sure you've made plenty of detailed notes about this time period for the factors that I have explained. If you need any more support, please pop over to iSpeakpe on the YouTube channel, and I'll see you again next time.